Hello, my friends. I'm going to read a story for you tonight, The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum. This is a very old story. It's one of the stories of The Wizard of Oz, which some of you may know. This story today that I'm reading is specifically dedicated to my sister Carol, who asked me to read her a story. When she was a little girl, I used to read her one chapter every night from one of the Oz books. Here's the illustrations for the first chapter. The Scarecrow of Oz. I bet a lot of you didn't know that there's more than one story of Oz. There's many stories of Oz, 8 of them to be specific. There's, of course, The Wizard of Oz, that everyone knows that story. The Land of Oz, Ozma of Oz, Dorothy and the Wizard in Oz, The Road to Oz, The Emerald City of Oz, The Patchwork Girl of Oz, Tick-Tock of Oz, and The Scarecrow of Oz. We're starting a little bit at the backwards because The Scarecrow of Oz is actually the last story in the series by L. Frank Baum. But they're old books, they're hard to come by, and this is the one that I have to read to you tonight. The Scarecrow of Oz. When we were little, we used to really enjoy looking at the illustrations of this book. This book is copyrighted in the year 1915. That means it's more than 100 years old. The author, L. Frank Baum, dedicated this story to the uplifters of Los Angeles, California, in grateful appreciation of the pleasure I have derived from association with them and in recognition of their sincere endeavor to uplift humanity through kindness, consideration, and good fellowship. They are big men, all of them, and all with generous hearts of little children. L. Frank Baum. Let's see. Here's the illustration for the dedication. Chapter 1. Twixt you and me, the army of children which besieged the post office conquered the postman and delivered to me its imperious commands, insisted that Trot and Cap'n Billy be admitted to the Land of Oz, where Trot could enjoy the society of Dorothy, Betsy Bobbin, and Ozma, while the one-legged sailor man might become a comrade of the Tin Woodman, the Shaggy Man, Tick-Tock, and all the other quaint people who inhabit this wonderful fairyland. It was no easy task to obey this order and land Trot and Cap'n Bill safely in Oz, as you will discover by reading this book. Indeed, it required the best efforts of our dear old friend the Scarecrow to save them from a dreadful fate on the journey. But the story leaves them happily located in Ozma's splendid palace, and Dorothy has promised me that Button Bright and the 3 girls are sure to encounter in the near future some marvelous adventures in the Land of Oz, which I hope to be permitted to relate to you in the next Oz book. Meantime, I am deeply grateful to my little readers for their continued enthusiasm over the Oz stories, as evinced in the many letters they send me, all of which are lovingly cherished. It takes more and more Oz books every year to satisfy the demands of old and new readers, and there have been formed many Oz reading societies where the Oz books, owned by different members, are read aloud. All this is very gratifying to me and encourages me to write more Oz stories. When the children have had enough of them, I hope they will let me know, and then I will try to write something different. L. Frank Baum, Royal Historian of Oz. That was his preface. Chapter 1, The Great Whirlpool. Ooh, that's an interesting picture. What do you think is going on there? Let's see, children. Seems to me, said Cap'n Bill as he sat beside Trot under the big acacia tree looking out over the blue ocean. Seems to me, Trot, as how the more we know, the more we find we don't know. I can't quite make that out, Cap'n Bill, answered the little girl in a serious voice after a moment's thought, during which her eyes followed those of the old sailor man across the glassy surface of the sea. Seems to me that all we learn is just so much gained. I know it looks that way at first sight, said the sailor, nodding his head, but those as knows the least have a habit of thinking they know all there is to know, while them that knows the most admits what a terrible big world this is. It's the knowing ones that realize one lifetime ain't long enough to get more than a few dips of the oars of knowledge. Trot didn't answer. She was a very little girl with big, solemn eyes and an earnest, simple manner. Cap'n Bill had been her faithful companion for years and had taught her almost everything she knew. He was a wonderful man, this Cap'n Bill. Not so very old, although his hair was grizzled, what there was of it. Most of his head was bald as an egg and as shiny as an oilcloth, and this made his big ears stick out in a funny way. His eyes had a gentle look and were pale blue in color, and his round face was rugged and bronzed. Cap'n Bill's left leg was missing, from the knee down, and that was why the sailor no longer sailed the seas. The wooden leg he wore was good enough to stomp around with on land, or even to take Trot out for a row or a sail on the ocean, but when it came to running up aloft or performing active duties on a shipboard, the old sailor was not equal to the task. The loss of his leg had ruined his career, and the old sailor found comfort in devoting himself to the education and companionship of the very little girl. The accident to Cap'n Bill's leg had happened at about the time Trot was born, and ever since that he had lived with Trot's mother as a star boarder. Having enough money saved up to pay for his weekly keep, he loved the baby and often held her on his lap. Her first ride was on Cap'n Bill's shoulders, for she had no baby carriage, and when she began to toddle around, the child and the sailor became close comrades and enjoyed many strange adventures together. It is said that the fairies had been present at Trot's birth and had marked her forehead with their invisible mystic signs so that she was able to see and do many wonderful things. The acacia tree was on top of a high bluff, but a path ran down the bag in a zigzag way to the water's edge, where Cap'n Bill's boat was moored to a rock by means of a stout cable. It had been a hot, sultry afternoon, with scarcely a breath of air stirring, so Cap'n Bill and Trot had been quietly sitting beneath the shade of the tree, waiting for the sun to get low enough for them to take a row. They had decided to visit one of the great caves which the waves had washed out of the rocky coast during many years of steady effort. The caves were a source of continual delight to both the girl and the sailor, who loved to explore their awesome depths. There's Cap'n Bill and Trot right behind him, surveying the sea. The old man cast a shrewd glance at the sky, the sea, and the motionless boat. Then he shook his head. "Maybe it's time, Trot," he answered, "but I don't just like the looks of things this afternoon." "What's wrong?" she asked wonderingly. "Can't say as to that. Things is too quiet to suit me, that's all. No breeze, not a ripple atop of the water, nary a gull flying anywhere, and the end of the hottest day of the year. I ain't no weather prophet, Trot, but any sailor would know the signs is ominous." "There's nothing wrong that I can see," said Trot. "If there were a cloud in the sky even as big as my thumb, we might worry about it. But look, Cap'n, the sky is as clear as can be." He looked again and nodded. "Perhaps we can make the cave all right," he said, agreeing, not wishing to disappoint her. "It's only a little way out, and we'll be on the watch, so come along, Trot." Together they descended the winding path to the beach. It was no trouble for the girl to keep the footing on the steep way, but Cap'n Bill, because of his wooden leg, had to hold on to the rocks and roots and now and then to save himself from tumbling. On a level path he was as spry as anyone, but to climb up a hill or down required some care. They reached the boat safely, and while Trot was untying the rope, Cap'n Bill reached into a crevice of the rock and drew out several tallow candles and a box of wax matches, which he thrust into the capacious pockets of his sou'wester. This sou'wester was a short coat of oilskin that the old sailor wore on all occasions, when he wore a coat at all, and the pockets always contained a variety of objects, useful and ornamental, which made even Trot wonder where they all came from and why Cap'n Bill should treasure them. The jackknives, a big one and a little one, the bits of cord, the fish hooks, the nails, these were handy to have on certain occasions, but bits of shell and tin boxes with unknown contents, buttons, pinchers, bottles of curious stones, and the like seemed quite unnecessary to carry around. That was Captain Bill's business, however, and now that he added the candles and matches to his collection, Trot made no comment, for she knew these last were to light their way through the caves. The sailor always rowed the boat, for he handled the oars with strength and skill. There's the pictures. Captain Bill and Trot on the sea. Trot sat at the stern and steered. The place where they embarked was a little bright or circular bay, and the boat cut across a much larger bay toward a distant headland where the caves were located, right at the water's edge. They were nearly a mile from shore and about halfway across the bay when Trot suddenly sat up straight and exclaimed, "What's that, Captain?" He stopped rowing and turned half around to look. "That, Trot," he slowly replied, "looks to me mighty like a whirlpool." "What makes it, Captain?" "A whirl in the air makes a whirl in the water. I was afraid as we'd meet with trouble, Trot. Things didn't look right. The air was too still." "It's coming closer," said the girl. The little old man grabbed the oars and began rowing with all his strength. "'Tain't coming closer to us, Trot," he gasped. "It's we that are coming closer to the whirlpool. The thing is drawing us to it like a magnet." Trot's sun-browned face was a little paler as she grasped the tiller firmly and tried to steer the boat away, but she said not a word to indicate fear. The swirl of the water that came nearer made a roaring sound that was fearful to listen to. So fierce and powerful was the whirlpool that it drew the surface of the sea into the form of a great basin slanting down toward the center, where a big hole had been made in the ocean, a hole with walls of water that were kept in place with the rapid whirling of the air. The boat in which Trot and Captain Bill were riding was just on the outer edge of this saucer-like slant, and the old sailor knew very well that unless he could quickly force the little craft away from the rushing current, they would soon be drawn into the great black hole that yawned in the middle. So he exerted all his might and pulled as he had never pulled before. He pulled so hard that the left oar snapped in two and sent Captain Bill sprawling upon the bottom of the boat. He scrambled up quickly enough and glanced over the side. Then he looked at Trot, who sat quite still with serious, faraway look in her sweet eyes. The boat was now speeding swiftly of its own accord, following the line of the circular basin, round and round, gradually drawing nearer to the great hole in the center. Any further effort to escape the whirlpool was useless, and realizing this fact, Captain Bill turned Trot and put an arm around her as if to shield her from the awful fate before them. He did not try to speak before the roar of the waters would have drowned the sound of his voice. These two faithful comrades had faced dangers before, but nothing equal to that which they faced now. Yet Captain Bill, noting the look in Trot's eyes and remembering how often she had been protected by unseen powers, did not quite give way to despair. The great hole in the dark water, now growing nearer and nearer and nearer, looked very terrifying, but they were both brave enough to face it and await the result of the adventure. Wow, that was a good story tonight, a good start. Should we go ahead and read another one? Chapter 2, The Cave Under the Sea. The circles were so much smaller at the bottom of the basin, and the boat moved so much more swiftly that Trot was beginning to get dizzy with the motion, when suddenly the boat made a leap and dived headward into the murky depths of the hole. Whirling like little tops, but still clinging together, the sailor and the girl were separated from their boat and plunged down, down, down into the furthermost recesses of the great ocean. At first their fall was swift as an arrow, but presently they seemed to be going more moderately, and Trot was almost sure that unseen arms were about her, supporting her and protecting her. That's a little mark that Captain Bill saw on her that he thought she was protecting. She could see nothing because the water filled her eyes and blurred her vision, but she clung fast to Captain Bill's sou'wester with other arms while other arms clung fast to her, so they gradually sank down and down until a full stop was made when they began to ascend again. But it seemed to Trot that they were not rising toward the surface from where they had come. The water was no longer whirling them, and they seemed to be drawn in a slanting direction through still, cool ocean depths. And then, in a much quicker time than I have told it, up they popped to the surface and were cast at full length upon a sandy beach where they lay choking and gasping for breath and wondering what had happened to them. Trot was the first to recover. Disengaging herself from Captain Bill's wet embrace and sitting up, she rubbed the water from her eyes and then looked around her. A soft, bluish-green glow lighted the place, which seemed to be sort of a cavern, for above and on either side of her were rugged rocks. They had been cast upon a beach of clear sand, which slanted upward from the pool of water at their feet, a pool which doubtless led into the big ocean that fed it. Above the reach of the waves of the pool were more rocks, and still more and more, into the dim windings and recesses of which the glowing light from the water did not penetrate. The palace looked grim and lonely, but Trot was thankful that she was still alive and had suffered no severe injury during her trying adventure underwater. At her side, Captain Bill was sputtering and coughing, trying to get rid of the water he had swallowed. Both of them were soaked through, yet the cave was warm and comfortable, and a wetting did not dismay the little girl in the least. She crawled up the slant of sand and gathered in her hand a bunch of dried seaweed, which she mopped the face of Captain Bill and cleared the water from his eyes and ears. Presently the old man sat up and stared at her intently. Then he nodded his bald head 3 times and said in a gurgling voice, "Mighty good, Trot, mighty good. We didn't reach Davy Jones' locker that time, did we? Though why we didn't and where we are is more'n I can make out." "Take it easy, Captain," she replied. "We're safe enough, I guess, at least for the time being." He squeezed the water out of the bottoms of his loose trousers and felt of his wooden leg and arms and head, finding he had brought all of his person with him, and gathered the courage to examine closely their surroundings. "Where do you think we are, Trot?" he presently asked. "Can't say, Captain. Perhaps in one of our caves." He shook his head. "No," he said, "I don't think that at all. The distance we came up didn't seem half as far as the distance we went down, and you'll notice there ain't any outside entrance to this cavern whatever. It's a regular dome over the pool of water, and unless there's some passage at the back up yonder, we're fast prisoners." Trot looked thoughtfully over her shoulder. "When we're rested," she said, "we will crawl up there and see if there's a way to get out." Captain Bill reached in the pocket of his oilskin coat and took out his pipe. It was still dry, for he kept it in an oilskin pouch with his tobacco. His matches were in a tight tin box, so in a few moments the old sailor was smoking contentedly. Trot knew it helped him to think when he was in any difficulty. Also, the pipe did much to restore the old sailor's composure after his long ducking and his terrible fright, a fright that was more on Trot's account than on his own. Oh, look, here's a picture of Trot. Isn't she pretty? The sand was dry where they sat and soaked up the water that dripped from their clothing. When Trot had squeezed the wet out of her hair, she began to feel much like her old self again. By and by, they got upon their feet and crept up the incline to the scattered boulders above. Some of these were of huge size, but by passing between some and around others, they were able to reach the extreme rear of the cavern. "Yes," said Trot with interest, "here's a round hole." "And it's black as night inside," remarked Cap'n Bill. "Just the same," answered the girl, "we ought to explore it and see where it goes, 'cause it's the only possible way we can get out of this place." Cap'n Bill eyed the hole doubtfully. "It may be the way out of here, Trot," he said, "but it may be a way into a far worse place than this. I'm not sure, but our best plan is to stay right here." Trot wasn't sure either when she thought of it in the light, and after a while she made her way back to the sands again, and Cap'n Bill followed her. As they sat down, the child looked thoughtfully at the sailor's bulging pockets. "How much food have we got, Captain?" she asked. "Half a dozen ship's biscuits and a hunk of cheese," he replied. You want some now, Trot? She shook her head, saying, that ought to keep us alive about 3 days if we're careful. Longer than that, Trot, said Cap'n Bill, but his voice was a little troubled and unsteady. But if we stay here, we're bound to starve in time, continued the girl. While if we go into the dark hole... Some things are more hard to face than starvation, said the sailor man gravely. We don't know what's inside of the dark hole, Trot, nor where it might lead us to. There's a way to find that out, she persisted. Instead of replying, Cap'n Bill began searching in his pockets. He soon drew out a little package of fishhooks and a long line. Trot watched him join them together. Then he crept a little way up the slope and turned over a big rock. 2 or 3 small crabs began scurrying away over the sands, and the old man caught them and put one on his hook and the other in his pocket. Coming back to the pool, he swung the hook over his shoulder and circled it around his head and cast it nearly into the water, the center of the water, where he allowed it to sink gradually, paying out the little line as far as it would go. When the end was reached, he began drawing it in again until the crab bait was floating on the surface. Trot watched him cast the line a second time and a third. She decided that there either were no fishes in the pool or they could not bite the hermit crab. But Cap'n Bill was an old fisherman and not easily discouraged. When the crab got away, he put another on the hook. When the crabs were all gone, he climbed up the rocks and found some more. Meantime, Trot, tired of watching him, and lay down upon the sands where she fell fast asleep. During the next 2 hours, her clothing dried completely, as did that of the old sailor. They were both so used to salt water that they were in no danger of taking cold. Finally, the little girl was wakened by a splash beside her and a grunt of satisfaction from Cap'n Bill. She opened her eyes to find that the captain had landed a silver-scaled fish weighing about 2 pounds. This cheered her considerably, and she hurried to scrape together a heap of seaweed while Cap'n Bill cut up the fish with his jackknife and got it ready for cooking. Oh, they got some fish to cook for dinner. They had cooked fish with seaweed before. Cap'n Bill wrapped the fish in some of the weed and dipped it in the water to dampen it. Then he lighted a match and set fire to Trot's heap, which speedily burned down to a glowing bed of ashes. When they laid the wrapped fish on the ashes, covered it with more seaweed, and allowed this to catch fire and burn to embers, after feeding the fire with seaweed for some time, the sailor finally decided that their supper was ready. So he scattered the ashes and drew out the bits of fish still encased in their smoking wrappings. When these wrappings were removed, the fish was found thoroughly cooked, and both Trot and Cap'n Bill ate of it freely. When these wrappings were removed, the fish was found thoroughly cooked, and both Trot and Cap'n Bill ate of it freely. It had a slight flavor of seaweed and would have been better with a sprinkling of salt. It was okay, so they were hungry. The soft glow which until now had lighted the cavern began to grow dim, but there was a great quantity of seaweed in that place, so after they had eaten their fish, they kept the fire alive for a time by giving it a handful of fuel now and then. From an inner pocket, the sailor drew a small flask of battered metal, unscrewing the cap, handed it to Trot. She took one swallow of the water, although she wanted more, and noticed that Cap'n Bill merely wet his lips with it. "S'pose," said she, staring at the glowing seaweed fire and speaking slowly, "that we can catch all the fish we need. How about the drinking water, Captain?" He moved uneasily, but did not reply. Both of them were thinking about the dark hole, but while Trot had little fear of it, the man could not overcome his dislike to enter the place. He knew that Trot was right, though. To remain in the cavern where they were now could only result in a slow but sure death. It was nighttime up on the earth's surface, so the little girl became drowsy and soon fell asleep. After a time, the old sailor slumbered on the sands beside her. It was very still, and nothing disturbed them for hours. When at last they woke, the cavern was light again. They had divided one of the biscuits and were munching it for breakfast when they were startled by a sudden splash in the pool. Looking toward it, they saw emerging from the water the most curious creature either of them had ever beheld. It wasn't a fish, Trot decided, nor was it a beast. It had wings, though, and queer wings they were, shaped like an inverted chopping bowl and covered with tough skin instead of feathers. It had 4 legs, much like the legs of a stork, only double the number, and its head was shaped a good deal like that of a polled parrot, with a beak that curved downward in front and upward at the edges, and was half bill and half mouth. That's a strange sounding bird. Here's a picture of it. What do you think? But to call it a bird was out of the question because it had no feathers except a crest of wavy plumes of scarlet color on the very top of its head. The strange creature must have weighed as much as Cap'n Bill, and as it floundered and struggled to get out of the water to the sandy beach, it was so big and unusual that both Trot and her companion stared at it in wonder that was not unmixed with fear. Well, that's where we're going to leave Cap'n Bill and Trot at tonight. And if you'll join me again tomorrow night, we'll read another chapter or two and see if we don't find out where they're at. Do you think that they're going to go into that black hole? I think it's possible. We'll see you tomorrow.